Hi and hello, I am Renny Hartman, and today I'm going to talk about John Sandford and several of the many books he has read and the different types. And the ones that I'm really interested in are the prey books, Prey, double as a prey that you hunt and prey that are hunted upon. And Sandford was born in 44 in Iowa, and in the beginning of his life was a journalist, just as Mark Twain was, and as William Cullen Bryant was, and as Hawthorne was, and many others. But in 89, he wrote two novels. The first, Prey, with Lucas Davenport, called Rules of Prey. He also wrote a kid book, Kidd. Now, Kidd is a former outlaw in the IT business, and there are a series of kid books, as there are a series of Lucas Davenport books. There are others that are related to Lucas. The Virgil Flower, who in Ocean Prey works with Lucas, but sometimes he has 14 books of his own, Virgil. And then there are other independent books that Sandford has read, and he has won all kinds of awards. And I think I have read all 24 Prey books over the years. And I started partly because they were set in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I didn't know anything about the Midwest. And they often traveled, they were going to go 500 miles here in 2 or 3 hours, or 300 miles there in an hour and a half, how they would ever do that. And Lucas Davenport, in the beginning, is simply a detective on the Minneapolis police. He's often described as looking like George Clooney, but I would think he looked much like Robert Mitchum. It would be Mitchum looks to me. He was very much after the women, something that they finally, Sandford smooths out and has him marry and has a family after a while. But he's also a little violent. He is also often in trouble for his activities. And then he progresses. He has to leave the Minneapolis police because of a possible trial and negative actions happening against him. And so he becomes part of the state investigation, the Bureau of Public Safety. He works for, kind of like a local FBI for a state. And then in the end, by the time you get to the last book that Lucas is dominated in, Ocean Spray, he's a federal marshal. Now, Ocean Spray moves out of the Midwest and out of the South to Miami. Sandford actually worked for newspapers in Miami at one time. It's kind of, I liked it because there's a tremendous amount of how local and state and federal groups work together on this enormous drug problem. Lucas comes in, and what has happened is a Coast Guard out with his family comes across a problem of these people that have dumped drugs into the ocean with markers, and then they go out with divers to pick them up. We're talking huge amounts. Another group of Coast Guard have come across the drugs. They're on a yacht called a Mako, and they shoot the Coast Guard. And once they've shot the Coast Guard, everybody starts to get involved to get whoever they are, and nobody has much of an inkling. And that's how Lucas first comes in, and he says the way to do it is to work the small people up. Find somebody that can give you somebody else who can give you somebody else, rather than trying to get big people, probably in New York, on the line. And he brings Virgil in to be a diver. So Virgil goes undercover and actually does become part of this Miami group that still have lots of drugs to recover. it can be very deep diving. There's a tremendous amount of information on diving and the equipment that are needed and the problems that you can have. You have to get used to going down so far, and you have to get used to coming up so that your blood will adjust to nitrogen. Otherwise, you can be killed by the depth that you dove to. And of course, I was scared to death that something was going to happen to Virgil because he was in a very, very precarious situation. I'm not sure what Virgil looks like. He's tall, he's in his 30s, he has long blonde hair, and he's always interested in rock bands. But he's a nature character. He's always out fishing and hunting, and he tows his boat everywhere. And here he has to learn to dive and be one of the divers. And they do work with the FBI, which is not my favorite group at the moment, if anyone has been following the Durham cases in Washington, D.C. But the FBI in Ocean Prey actually look good, and you read a tremendous amount of how they actually function, what is important to them, how political they are, and how in order actually to work, sometimes they have to be not political because crime sometimes just has its own category. They want not only to get the group in Miami, but they want to get the big honchos in the bigger cities, which they believe is New York, so that some of the setting is also in New York City, although Lucas is not really in New York City. But he is in Miami. He goes to a boat show. If you're interested in reading about boats and boat shows, we have a whole huge chapter on boats and what they cost and how they are maintained and run and who buys them and who uses them and what you can do with them. Unfortunately, what criminals are doing with them is often really very successful. The ocean is big. They have a hard time finding. They have their own people out looking for the drugs that have been dropped off, and they know that they have some kind of marker signal on them, but they can't find them. They don't find them until Virgil is able to go underground and become the diver for the criminals. And I'm not going to say how this exactly turns out, but you can make a good guess on exactly how it turns out. And there have been 24 prey books. I will read off some of them. Rules of Prey started. Then we had Shadow Prey, Eyes of Prey, Silent Prey, Winter Prey, Night Prey, Mind Prey, Sudden Prey, Secret Prey. And the last one with Lucas was Ocean Prey. And the newest one, which I have to admit I didn't read, is not a prey. It's called The Investigator. And it involves, evidently, the daughter that Lucas adopted during one of the books. She was partly in a criminal situation, but she was a child who was a wild child who kind of lived on her own and comes over to Lucas, and he actually adopts her. And he now has his own home, and he has a wife. She's a surgeon, and they have their own son. And he starts out having his own money because just before he really becomes a significant policeman, he created one of the first video games and was able to sell that for millions so that Sandford could write Rules of Prey and Lucas could do all the crazy things that he sometimes does and he has the money for because he has his own money and he's not just getting paid for being a cop. And I think that's what I'm going to say for today. And I would say read them from the beginning. They are really interesting. Sometimes they're a little weird because sometimes you have a serial murderer who's really a terrible kind of individual and has to be tracked down. You hear a lot about the Midwest, Iowa and the Idahos. You're all over Minneapolis. There's other wonderful minor characters. Delaware, who's one of the Minneapolis police, who's never in uniform because he's always undercover. And the dialogue is often very clever and very interesting. And the other characters Lucas is a marshal, but he also works with half a dozen other characters that are also mentioned and come in and out of the books. They might be in Ocean Prey, but they weren't in the book before, but they were in the book 5 times before that. Okay, so that's my talk for today. Take a look at John Sandford and look at the Prey books.